If you've been a Dungeon Master for long, you've probably felt a bit of that Dungeon Master's block. Game night is just a couple nights away, or maybe a couple hours away, and you just don't know what to do. Somehow or another, you always seem to stumble into something that works pretty well, but you're not quite sure how to duplicate that success. And you want to become more efficient, and you want to be more confident when you step up to the table. Or maybe you're totally new to this. You finally worked up to the guts to volunteer to be the DM, and you just don't know where to start. Well, stay tuned, because in this video we'll be talking about how you can plan your own amazing RPG adventures. No published adventure book, just your brain and maybe a little help from a funny looking guy on the internet. Let's do it. Hi everybody, welcome to WASD 20. My name is Nate, and you are watching The Dungeon Master's Journey. This is a series where I talk about all things relevant to Dungeon Masters, Game Masters, whatever. You might remember a few months ago on The Dungeon Master's Journey, we talked about running published adventures. Adventure modules are great, and I think there's a lot of Dungeon Masters who benefit from them. I'll put a link to that video up at the top there, and you can definitely go check that out. But today we're going to be talking about running your own adventures. This was a comment that I got a lot on that video, actually. People asking if I would do a video on running your own adventure. So in this video, we're going to be talking about the basic building blocks of your own adventure. Then we'll be talking about different types of adventures, different types of activities that your characters will be engaging in during these adventures. We'll be talking about encounter archetypes, loot, NPCs, and probably a couple other things as well. So first off, the building blocks. What do you need? You need a world. You need a setting for your game. Now, don't think about it, especially if you're new, that you need to create an entire world here. You could use a pre-published setting if you want to, but I highly recommend, if you're brand new, starting with a town and a surrounding wilderness area. And maybe the characters aren't even going to be getting into the town in this first adventure. Maybe they're just going to be out in the wilderness, and that's fine. There's monsters out there. It's a great place for an adventure. Once you have your setting established, you'll want to think about a story that would make sense for this setting. Now, don't write the whole story. That's a big mistake. You want to make sure, since this is a tabletop role-playing game, that you leave room for player agency and for the player characters, who should be the stars of the story, to have some level of direction in the narrative. Now, in order to tell a good story, you're obviously going to need some conflict. You're going to need a threat, or maybe the conflict is a mystery to be solved, or maybe the conflict is things that the players encounter on a quest. As we start talking about adventure types and encounter archetypes, I definitely recommend you think in scenes and to plan out somewhere between 2 and 10 scenes for a 2.5 to 3.5 hour session, which is really the sweet spot for me. That's a pretty wide range. I usually plan 3 to 5 scenes, and this is also something that Sly Flourish talks about in The Lazy Dungeon Master, which is a book I highly recommend. As you're planning your scenes, don't overdo it. Just a few lines is really all you need. If you're doing more than that, you're going to get too invested in one of these scenes, and what if your players happen to decide actually to bypass a scene? If you over-prep, you're not going to be as adaptable in general, and your players will have less agency in the game, and I think that's a problem. Another book that you may have heard of is the Dungeon Master's Guide for D&D 5th edition. Another really good one. In this book, they talk about 2 basic types of adventures and some more types within those. But the 2 basic types are location-based adventures and event-based adventures. Location-based adventures are going to be the most common and probably the most simple. You are going to have your players exploring an area or maybe delving a dungeon. The most common sorts of areas are dungeons, which are not only underground prisons, right? Dungeons can be a castle, a ruined temple, it could be a maze, it could be a wizard's tower, any sort of enclosed area where the dungeon master has a little more control over the encounters is going to fit that archetype of a dungeon. Or it could be a wilderness area. A dungeon or a wilderness area are going to be the 2 most common adventure locations, but there are all sorts of other possibilities as well. The players might be, for example, defending a town, or maybe they're escaping from a prison. I guess that one's kind of like a dungeon. Maybe they have a moving location. Maybe they have to retrieve a stolen item from a caravan or a ship. All of these are location-based adventures, and they work really well. Almost all the adventures I run are location-based adventures. But you could also have event-based adventures. You're going to want to start with an event if you're doing this, some kind of framing event. It could be a festival, a religious festival, a historical commemoration. It could be the coronation of a ruler. It could be a tournament. The likely objectives in an event-based adventure would be securing aid from a ruler, perhaps, winning the tournament, overthrowing a ruler, or maybe stopping some sort of growing corruption. Event-based adventures could take the form of a mystery. A mystery is just a strange occurrence. It could be a disappearance, or maybe a gruesome murder. It could also take the form of intrigue. This would probably be like going back to what I said about securing aid from a ruler or overthrowing a ruler. Those are forms of intrigue. It's when your characters are basically playing politics. They're making connections. They're exchanging favors, perhaps. The thing with these event-based adventures, especially with mysteries and intrigue, is they're a little more complex. You, as the dungeon master, have to be either really comfortable with improv, or you have to know certain locations and NPCs really, really well in order to make these work. So if you're new to it and you're maybe planning your first adventure, I would recommend most likely sticking with the location-based adventure. Though early on, I did run a mystery game and I thought it actually went really well. So if you feel comfortable, go for it. So those are two basic adventure types. Now in this book, they also do talk about the three pillars of RPGs, and those are exploration, social interaction, and combat. Those are things that personally I try to find a balance of in each and every session. Some sessions are going to be heavier on one than another, but I try to put at least a little bit of each in any given session. Sometimes we're going to find that my players are comfortable with very little combat. If there's a lot of good social interaction and story development, that can be okay. Other groups are not going to be okay with that. They're going to want a lot of combat. So once you get to know your group a little better, you'll be more comfortable with this. But if you're just starting off, I recommend trying to find a pretty good balance between exploration, social interaction, and combat. Those three pillars. Before we get much further into the video, I want to take a quick second here to thank my partners over at Rollgate. I'll put a link to their site in the video description. Rollgate is an amazing tool for play-by-chat role-playing game experiences. I've had a lot of fun with it over the last couple months. They're starting to feature my videos occasionally, and I really appreciate it, and I want to make sure I keep giving them support as well, so go check them out. In the Game Mastery Guide for Pathfinder, which is a book I recommend even if you never plan to play Pathfinder, this is a really, really good resource. A lot of good system agnostic stuff here that can work for any fantasy RPG. I highly recommend it. But they talk about different types of encounter archetypes within the dungeon section here. And those encounter archetypes can also be useful to think about, including a little bit of variety. If you're in a dungeon, which is a common adventuring location, you'll probably want to have some combat. I think you know what that is. You're probably going to want to have some hazards or obstacles. Now, these could be very static hazards and obstacles, like fording a river or climbing up a cliff or something like that. Or they could be much more dynamic, like a lightning storm or something like that. You might want to include some puzzles. That's another encounter archetype. Personally, I'm not very good at them, and I usually have to end up looking up someone else's puzzles, but they can be a lot of fun. You might want to include some random encounters. If your players decide to rest or they decide to travel, these are a good thing to include. You might roll, first of all, to see if one even happens, and then if it does happen, usually you have a random encounters chart. You can get those in books like this, or you can find them all over the internet. Often they're based on the type of environment that your characters are in. So a fair number of those probably are going to be encountering a monster or wild animal, but it could be an NPC, and it could be hostile, or it could be neutral, or it could be friendly, or it just depends on how your party interacts with that encounter. There could also be weather-based encounters too. You could roll for all sorts of things. It doesn't just have to be combat. Another encounter archetype mentioned in here are story encounters, and these I would kind of put under the pillar of social interaction in most cases, but a story encounter could be a major development of the story based on a discovery of something in a dungeon, for example, an ancient tome or some sort of artifact. Either way, story encounters can be really valuable. You want to make sure it's not just all about killing monsters and getting loot. if you want to tell a greater story. Lastly, this book does mention special encounters, and those are basically combinations of at least two of the above. So you might have a combat in which there's also a puzzle to be solved that could end that combat more quickly, for example. So as you're thinking about these, you might want to think of them in scenes. Now, a dungeon might be one scene, or depending on how you look at it, a dungeon could be multiple scenes. But once you've got your basic adventure type, and then some of the activities your characters are likely to engage in during this adventure, you'll also probably want to think about NPCs, loot, and possibly a twist. So NPCs. I definitely recommend keeping your descriptions of NPCs very brief. Come up with a name. You can use random name generators or look them up. You can come up with an occupation, personality, appearance, maybe a bond or flaw or secret of some kind. But I really keep them very brief, just a line or two. The thing is, if you overdevelop your NPCs, you might find that your characters just decide they're going to kill this NPC or not talk to them anymore and kick them out. And then you've done a whole lot of work and that NPC is totally out of the picture. So I definitely recommend keeping it very brief. If you need a stat block, you can always look that up on the spot, or as I often do, just make up some stats. But give them some personality and make your NPCs a lot of fun for your party. Loot. This is a major weakness of mine. I often kind of forget about the loot and just end up winging it, and it usually doesn't go all that well. I could do to spend a lot more time looking up some loot tables in a book like this, or looking them up online, looking up the appropriate amount of gold for a party of a certain level so that you're not totally breaking your economy. I can't give you much advice on that because I'm just not very good at it, but there are resources out there, and you should probably think ahead and actually plan some loot that your characters will find in this location or that location. A twist. I would definitely recommend trying to include a twist in most of your adventures, and it doesn't have to be some huge plot twist that's just mind-blowing every single time. That would probably be overdoing it. But I like to include ways that the players discover that there's more to a situation than they initially thought. Perhaps the big bad they finally encounter is actually not so bad, or perhaps the big bad is only the minion of a much bigger bad that the players didn't previously know about. Perhaps, if the players are trying to root out some corruption, they actually find that the relative of one of the player characters is actually at the heart of some of this corruption, or the mayor of the town, or whatever it might be. Including these twists can really hook your players in and get them more engaged in the story that you are telling together. And speaking of this, a last point that I definitely want to drive home is I think that one of the big advantages of running your own adventures, homebrew, your own creation, is that you can tie in player backgrounds and backstories. I think this is a huge advantage that an adventure module just can't touch, because those people who wrote that module don't know your characters like you do. As you are learning more and more about these characters and asking your players questions about them, which is something I recommend you do, use those backstories. Maybe the quest giver for a given adventure is actually a relative of one of the player characters. Maybe the villain is actually a fellow faction member of the fighter of your party. Or maybe the ruined temple that the party is going to is actually dedicated to the deity that your cleric worships. Try to think about at least one sort of player character hook, a way that you can tie in at least one of your player character's backgrounds. And as you get better at this, it'll happen more naturally, and you can do more than one, certainly. And you might find little ways to insert hooks into each of the player character's background in every session. That might be a bit ambitious, but either way, give it a try tying in your player's background and stories. If you're not doing this, I think you're missing out on some major opportunities for amazing collaborative storytelling. So to review, don't forget the building blocks. You've got your setting first, then you get your story and your conflict. It's important to think about adventure type and some of the encounters or scenes that will be taking place in your adventure. Think ahead about NPCs and loot, and consider a twist. If you feel like I'm missing something here, definitely leave your comments down below. I know there's a lot more experienced dungeon masters out there than me, and you might have a lot of good things to say. So leave it down below if you have some tips, some resources for people prepping their own D&D adventures. That's all for this one, everybody. I want to thank you so much for joining me. I want to thank my patrons very much for their support. You can join with them in support of this channel by going to patreon.com/WASD20. There's some pretty cool rewards, and even $1 or $2 a month can actually add up to make a big difference for me. So I really appreciate it. If you're not able to support on Patreon, another great way you can support is by buying through some of my affiliate links. I've got affiliate links to some of the books I mentioned down in the video description. And if you enjoyed this one, make sure you give it a thumbs up. Make sure you're subscribed. I want to thank you all so much for joining me. Everybody take care. You'll see me again very soon.